Okay, so this is a video on our historical themes. So this is the fifth in the series. So today, this is a video on the interactional theme. So the theme of interaction, specifically interaction with the environment. So if you took AP Human Geography, this is pretty much what you do in AP Human Geography. So before we delve into an example here, which will be the Greeks, so we'll look at the Greeks and their neighbors. Let's look at what historians focus on. For interaction. And what we're going to see is that when we look at interaction, we're looking at a lot of stuff that's going to overlap with other themes. So we're going to look at things like war, disease, migration, settlement, urbanization, and trade. So a lot of this stuff deals with things like diffusion, cultural diffusion. We've got an economic idea here with trade, some social stuff with urbanization, political stuff with war. So there's a lot of overlap with other themes. In fact, we're never really going to use interaction as our primary lens, but interaction with the environment is always going to be a good secondary lens to look at why things are happening. So if we think about war, for example, we might think about the political reasons for war, but we might also want to think about the environmental reasons for war. Are there resources to gather? Is it access to a port or a harbor? So these are environmental concerns that might also start a war. And when we think about these other ideas, a lot of these are social or cultural or economic ideas, the interactional side, the environmental side of that is something we always want to keep in the back of our minds. So, the best example for the ancient world thinking about interaction is the Greeks. Now, there are a couple of reasons why we want to focus in on the Greeks for understanding interaction. The first is that, like Mesopotamia, Greece was a crossroads for trade. So not to the same extent that Mesopotamia was, linking big societies with other big societies. Greece was more a regional trade hub, but they were still an important crossroads for trade. So the people who live in and around Greece, so we might think like the Greeks themselves, the Phoenicians, the Macedonians, all of these people that are kind of around Greece were either trading or they were influenced by merchants who are coming through the area. So we're seeing a lot of opportunity here for cultural diffusion, cultural or social diffusion. So we see lots of opportunities for that because Greece was a crossroads for trade. Another reason that we want to look at the Greeks for this particular theme is that unlike other societies, which arose around agriculture, the Greeks arose around trade. So the Greeks arose around trade. The reason for this, there's not a lot of good farmland in Greece. So Greece is a relatively small peninsula. It's surrounded by water, and the land itself is not that great for farming. There's not a lot of it, and it's not that good for growing the kinds of crops you need for large-scale agriculture. But what the land here is good for, this is good farmland for growing trade crops or cash crops. Specifically, olives, which can be turned into olive oil, and grapes, which can be turned into wine. So instead of growing a lot of crops themselves, the Greeks would grow olives and grapes and trade this stuff for food. Grains. You can eat olives and grapes, of course, but you'd really want to trade that stuff for grains because that's the stuff that will last longer. More people can eat that stuff. So let's take a look at how the Greeks actually interacted with the environment. So, because the Greeks were kind of isolated on their peninsula, and there weren't a lot of Greeks, they relied on, I guess, what we would call colonization to expand. Basically, what they would do is they would set up small Greek trade outposts throughout the Mediterranean. So throughout the Mediterranean Sea, they'd set up these small trade outposts. It's just a port, maybe a little town on the coast, and they would use it to trade. But by doing so, this would also help spread the Greek language, and specifically the Greek alphabet. More on that in a second. They would spread the Greek language, they would spread Greek religion, and Greek culture. So all throughout the Mediterranean, you've got people speaking Greek, practicing Greek religion, and practicing Greek culture, not because the Greeks are forcing them to, but because these ideas are simply being diffused out to new places through interaction. And the interaction here is specifically trade. Now, little side note about the alphabet. Let's look at the Greek alphabet for a second. So writing and language and writing forms like an alphabet, ways of record keeping, have been around for a long time. We've seen cuneiform in Mesopotamia, Egyptian hieroglyphics. But what the Greeks did, and specifically the Phoenicians developed a method of writing that was not dependent on a specific style of writing. So if you wanted to communicate with somebody with cuneiform, you had to write in cuneiform. If you wanted to communicate with somebody in hieroglyphics, you had to understand hieroglyphics. But what the Phoenicians did is they created symbols for sounds. So like this symbol makes a certain sound, and this symbol makes a certain sound. And so what they did was they created a phonetic alphabet. And that's actually where we get the word phonics from. So that's a way of sounding out words, basically. Comes from the Phoenicians. And so the reason they did that is because they are the ones trading with all the people with different styles of record keeping. And so what the Phoenicians wanted was they wanted one way to communicate with all of them, and the alphabet was what they used. And it was so simple and elegant that just about every society around the world picked it up. Now, the word alphabet actually comes from the Greek because it's the first two letters of the Greek alphabet, alpha and beta. So diffusion through trade is what gave us our alphabet. So the Greeks were very important in understanding interaction because of the way they traded. They simply didn't have the manpower or the resources to take over large pieces of territory. So instead, they just spread their culture, and they kind of created a Greek cultural empire where it didn't matter what religion you practiced or what culture you had, but you're probably going to be using a lot of Greek stuff. You're probably going to be speaking Greek. You're probably going to be eating Greek food or dressing in the Greek way. Even though the Greeks aren't in charge, the Greeks are everywhere. And so through spreading their culture, through interaction of trade, the Mediterranean Sea kind of became a Greek area. Now, that's not the only way that interaction happens. So we've kind of looked at this through a socio-cultural lens, interaction that way, but you can also spread stuff through war. And that is also where we can look at the Greeks. So if we think about this a different way, and we think about interaction through conquest, the Greek guy we want to think about is Alexander the Great. Who is doing most of his conquering around, we'll say about 200 BCE. This is a signpost date. It's not really that important for anything, but just to kind of give you an idea when he's doing stuff. He's going to be doing most of his stuff around 200 BCE. Now, Alexander is not Greek. Alexander is Macedonian. So right now, Macedonia is just north of Greece. So this is the area that's just north of what is now Greece. It was like a neighboring province of the Greeks. He spoke Greek. He was very well aware of Greek culture. One of his teachers was actually Aristotle, who was one of the most famous Greek philosophers. So he was very, very well acquainted with who the Greeks were and what they did. Alexander the Great was, at the time, one of the greatest military thinkers of all time. He was one of the greatest military thinkers of all time. Put him up there with guys like Napoleon. So he revolutionized the way we think about fighting, about warfare. Alexander never lost a battle. He never lost a battle. His big contribution to military thinking is this formation called the Phalanx, which is kind of like a square of soldiers with shields pointed out and up. So it could just move forward without being attacked, and as it moves, it's got spears pointed out. So it's basically like an ancient tank. It was very difficult to defend against, and it would basically just roll over enemy soldiers. He took over first Greece. So he took over Greece. So the two main places in Greece, he took over Athens and Sparta. So he took over all of Greece. Then he took over Egypt. And then he went and took over Persia. And we mentioned Alexander in a previous video when we talked about the collapse of the Achaemenid Empire. So that was what Alexander did. Alexander took over Persia. Now, once he had done this, it had taken him about 10 years to do all of this. It took about 10 years to conquer all of this. And Alexander wanted to keep going. Alexander wanted to keep conquering. His soldiers wanted to go home, though. They probably could have kept going when they got to India, but Alexander's soldiers wanted to go home, and so they did. They left Alexander, and Alexander kind of just followed his soldiers back home to Macedonia, but on the way there, on the way back home, Alexander died. And his giant empire, his new giant empire, collapsed without him to be in charge of it. So his new giant empire collapsed. We don't know where Alexander's body ended up, so it's been lost to history. People have been looking for Alexander's tomb. We just don't know where it might be at this point. Now, the point of understanding all this stuff about Alexander is not that he was a military genius. That's interesting. But for our purposes here, because Alexander was Greek, all the areas that he took over also became Greek. And by doing this, the Greek language became what was known as a lingua franca, meaning a kind of universal language, a language that everyone spoke. Kind of like how English is a lingua franca now. Like if you go anywhere, someone around there will speak a few words of English. So back then, it was Greek. So the Greek language became a lingua franca across Eurasia. So you could find people speaking Greek you could find people in what is now Spain all the way to India. You could find people speaking Greek all the way from Spain to India. Some of that is due to the peaceful diffusion of Greek culture through trade. Some of it is due to violent interaction through Alexander's conquest. But in both cases, they both serve to spread Greek culture, Greek language, and for a long time, Greek was the language of academics, it was the language of education, and that's thanks to both Greek trade and Greek conquest, both forms of interaction. So with that, that's the fifth of our 6 course themes. Our last video on course themes will be on the cultural stuff. And that'll be our last video on this series. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.